Hi, my name is Dr. Bierdz. I am an assistant professor of curriculum studies at Georgia Southern University, and this will be a video abstract on a paper that I recently wrote with the journal Educational Theory. So very briefly, I'll go over the arguments that I make in the paper and just give you a kind of insight into what the paper's about and I guess what the point of the article is very generally. The article I wrote is called "The Educative as Violent: Anti-Educational Impossibilities slash Possibilities." So basically, I think the colon is useful here because the title kind of separates the two arguments that I am making in the paper. On one hand, for instance, I am making the argument, uh, the successive argument of the whole host of curriculum studies as a field that education is violent in various ways, right? Education perpetuates forms of class violence, forms of gendered violence, forms of epistemic violence or knowledge-based violence. But I am also kind of expanding that to the very notion of education, right? That education, as it has continuously been defined and redefined, is necessarily violent. That our imaginations of education as a field, as something that is lived, as something that is experiential, necessitates various forms of violence. And I go through like various forms of violence, physical, kind of visceral, material, compulsive forms of violence. I go over kind of epistemic or knowledge-based forms of violence. And then I also go over kind of ontic or ontological forms of violence in which we're defining what being is in a kind of normative sense, right? Um, and then on the other side of the colon, I am also making the argument that to think more broadly, right, to think outside of the box of education, outside of this kind of violent or necessarily harmful version of education as writ large, right, capital E education, we need to think outside of that. We need to think anti-educationally, right? What exists beyond those bounds, right? How do we break those borders down that kind of confine or condone or cordon this kind of violence, right? And how do we imagine impossibilities, possibilities for future educations outside of that that are more liberatory, more nonviolent, more livable for more people, right? Um, and that's the argument, right? Pretty simply put. If you have any other questions, I'd suggest reading the article or I'd push you towards that. It's a little bit more theoretically dense, but it does get into the weeds of that question of how the notion of education itself is violent, right? How it's understood as violent, and how we might kind of play with getting outside of that box. But yeah, thank you. Thank you.